Everyone, how are you doing today? Good. Well, I'm really excited to be here this morning. Again, my name is Meaghan Lewis, and this session is all about making cross-browser testing beautiful. So here's a little bit of an outline of what we're going to be going over the next 40 minutes or so. But before I jump right into it, I kind of just want to get an idea of why you all decided to attend this session and kind of what you expect to get out of it. I guess there's a lot of us in the audience, so I can't hear from every one of you, but I'll just kind of ask a few questions and you can respond by raising your hand. So how many of you have implemented automated cross-browser tests before, by show of hands? Oh, cool. That's a lot. All right. And how many of you, I guess, have felt pain when kind of writing these cross-browser tests? I think that's the same number of hands I saw as before. All right, so that's good. I think that kind of helps set the tone a little bit. So I'm really excited to talk about this topic and to kind of help share some kind of like tricks and tips about how to make cross-browser testing more efficient in the future. So without further ado, I'm going to start with the why. I think we all understand, what this is. Lots of you have actually built these tests before. So why do we do cross-browser testing in the first place? And I think the first point is if it's important that all your customers have the same look and feel across browsers, then you want to be doing cross-browser testing. This way you can really have confidence that the application works the same across all major browsers. And by having a framework in place to do cross-browser testing, you can really easily test changes in different browsers. And this is both kind of at a visual and functional level, where you're able to kind of catch issues faster and hopefully stop a lot of things before they come into production and before you have to hear about it from your customers. And third, by automating your cross-browser test, you can save so much time from manually testing all these features. Of course, there is the time that goes into building and maintaining these tests over time, but I don't think it kind of compares to the amount of exhaustive manual testing that you can do. So now I want to talk about how. And I think once you're at the point where you know that cross-browser testing is for you and it's going to be beneficial to your project, I always kind of like to stop and ask myself some questions. Number one, I want to get a really good idea of what browsers are going to be supported, and that's kind of best to come up with the help of like a product team or kind of like some kind of information about like what your application or what your project is officially going to support. What are the most important workflows to test? I'm sure you are working on applications that have lots of different features, but thinking about maybe kind of if you already have tests and you want to build out your test to support multiple browsers, you might want to think about kind of like what is the most important workflow to focus on at first. And third, how will the test be run? Before I ever write any test, I'm constantly thinking about how am I going to run these tests, how are my teammates going to run them, and that includes both locally and as well as in continuous integration. So I'm going to talk about these in a little bit more detail through the help of a case study. So this past year, I was working at a financial tech startup in San Francisco. I was the first QA engineer to this company, and we were working on testing this student loan refinance application. So I was really excited to come in and add a lot of test coverage, and I kind of decided to start with this one feature in particular. The first step to any kind of student loan refinance application was filling out this rate check form. This form, just kind of a simple form, you fill out basic information about yourself, and after you submit it, you get a sample you get some sample rates back about what kind of interest rates that you might have for this loan. So I decided to start with this form in particular since it was the first step of the application. All customers need to do this, and it was really, really crucial that this kind of be working 100% of the time. I was working on a team that deployed to production multiple times a day, so I think just by automating this one feature alone, it kind of was a win, just to know that customers could always submit this form. Because I think in the situation where they couldn't, it would be super easy for customers just to be like, oh, forget this product, I'm gonna go use one of the competitors. I can easily get a loan with them. So automating this, again, was a huge, huge win. Or that is until customers start complaining that hey, I noticed that I can't submit this form in Internet Explorer 8, or this specific dropdown does not work in Safari, or very kind of specific use cases that I honestly couldn't really say whether or not that the application worked the same in all browsers, because at that point I hadn't really gone through and tested all these different combinations myself. So I began to think, like, what can I do to kind of help make this better and really have the confidence that I know that my application works in all these different browsers. And the solution was to implement automated cross-browser test. So before I got straight into writing the test, I stopped to ask myself those questions that we just talked about. So step one was all about deciding my supported browsers, because at that point, the company didn't really have anything that they officially supported. We assumed lots of customers used Chrome, but it was kind of like there was not a lot of information backing that. So definitely when you are deciding what to actually support, I would use the help of data. So this is a resource here of kind of the most popular browsers like across the world. And I don't know if everyone can see this, but Chrome is by far number one at 72.5%. That's from September. So I mean, a lot of people are using Chrome. Coming in at second is Firefox, which is not even close at like 16%, and then followed by IE, Safari, and Opera's kind of just hanging on there at the end. So I think this is helpful just to get an idea of generally kind of what browsers people are using across the world. But to get a little bit more specific, detailed information about how customers are specifically interacting with your application, I would use the help of Google Analytics. Google Analytics is really great. This is kind of a snapshot of this student loan refinance application that I was testing at the time. And I could see that Chrome still had the most number of visits. Chrome was still kind of by far number one. But Firefox was following kind of closely behind that. Firefox and Internet Explorer were pretty close together in terms of users. And then Safari was kind of down there as well, with 10% of our users using Safari. So I decided from this list here that we would be supporting these top 4 browsers: Chrome, Firefox, Internet Explorer, and Safari, and the latest 2 major releases of those browsers. So next, I kind of started to think about exactly what would be automated. And I had previously built out this automation for this rate check form to work in Firefox. That was before I kind of had the help of deciding exactly which browsers that I wanted to support. So I thought it would be kind of best to build out upon that feature and expand that feature. So I would have it run across all these 4 different browsers. And then next I started to think about actually how I was going to run these tests. So the first point, and I think number one, I would always recommend to run your test in continuous integration. You spend a lot of time writing these tests, and I think continuous integration is kind of really the best way to get that valuable feedback about the state of your application and how things are working. The next point I think is fairly obvious, but you need access to all your supported browsers to test them. For like the past few years, have worked in companies that are like Mac shops only. So just even to think about testing Internet Explorer, I had to kind of consider my options. Was I going to set up a physical machine for testing for Internet Explorer? Was I going to use the help of some kind of virtual machine? So I kind of started thinking about my options and decided to go with Sauce Labs. And I would just highly recommend kind of considering cloud testing tools. I think it worked really well for me, and kind of the environment I was in, this startup, it's a very fast-paced environment. I didn't really have a lot of time to think about how to set up this infrastructure otherwise. So Sauce Labs was really great at allowing me to kind of get set up really fast and thinking about how I could test across multiple browsers. And this image here to the right kind of just shows this platform configurator option where you're able to come in and select through a multitude of browsers. There's even some kind of mobile browsers that you have available to you. And then from there, you can select particular versions, operating systems, as well as even things like resolution. So you really have the option to customize your tests based on kind of different users' experiences and simulate different user experiences. So then step 4 is write some tests. By this point, you have a really good idea of what browsers that you're going to be supporting, what tests that you're actually going to be writing, and how you're going to be running your tests. So step 4, the fun part, is all about writing tests. And this is kind of what the test that I originally wrote that looked like for this rate check feature. So I thought it would be really easy to, instead of running this test and just Firefox, I would be able to switch out the drivers and run them against Chrome, IE, and Safari. So it should be as easy as changing the driver, right? You think, you already have this test script. It should kind of be as easy as just changing the driver. They should run, and everything would be a snap, ideally. So I tried that. I tried first to point my test against Chrome. They failed immediately, and kind of went through the same process for the other two browsers, and just kept failing. So I think that's when I determined, and I kind of imagined it ideally that this would take about a day going into it, just kind of building out this simple test to run across many browsers, but I kind of quickly realized that that would not be the truth. So now I kind of want to talk about some of the common problems that I encountered when running my cross-browser test. And the first has to do with page elements. So just kind of a few notes about page elements, I think, is when you're thinking about optimizing your test for cross browsers, is that most elements are probably going to be okay. Like in that form that I showed, there were just kind of various text fields, text areas, drop-downs, kind of common page elements. But some in particular were a little bit tricky to deal with. So drop-downs, radio buttons, and checkboxes I found were kind of giving me errors. And Firefox, where it was able to click on this element immediately, like in Chrome, it would just pass to the next step and never click on this element. So I began to think, what is different about this? What can I do to actually make sure that I can kind of cover my bases and make sure all these kind of problem elements are covered? And I think the best tip that I have for this is to use the same locator for each browser. So I found that the locator that I used for Firefox didn't work for Chrome, but it was kind of like a trial and error process almost to kind of go through and determine what would be the best locator to work for all of my browsers. Kind of what would be that one kind of stone that can kill many birds, I guess. And kind of what I found in this was that when I was using this kind of a CSS locator, that it was allowing me kind of a lot of flexibility to select the particular element that I wanted, and that kind of seemed to work for me across all the different browsers that I was testing. So I'm going to show an example, but this was kind of just a common error that I continue to get. And if you guys have run cross-browser tests before, you've probably seen this error too. It's about, you probably can't see it all the way in the back, but it's saying that the element is not clickable at point, and then I get these kind of random coordinates. I'm trying to figure out what is going on here. So this is an example that I have of a checkbox from this rate check form that I was automating. And you see it's kind of just a regular checkbox here asking for citizenship status. And this was kind of the HTML that encapsulated this particular object. So it has various things that I might be able to use when automating. It has various classes, IDs, names. So originally, when I had written this test in Firefox, I was able to kind of just find this element by ID, this citizenship status element, and click on it. But that was totally not working in any of my other browsers. So I kind of went through and tried to figure out what kind of would be the best locator to use. So I tried different classes, different IDs, and kind of nothing was working until I ended up trying this CSS locator, this label, the label here at the bottom for citizenship status, and that kind of worked like a dream. I ran this across all my other browsers, and everything was passing. So kind of just showing the process of how I went through and decided what would be the best locator for all of these different browsers. Definitely kind of sometimes a tedious process, but definitely worth it to determine what would be the best and kind of universal locator to work for all my tests. So the next kind of problem that I ran into was timing issues. So just a few notes on timing issues is that just some drivers are faster than others. I think there's kind of a spectrum here where you have Chrome driver and Firefox driver are pretty fast, and then Safari driver, and then IE driver are slow. So you have to kind of take that into consideration as well when you're running your test. And also kind of take into consideration the differences between maybe running on your local machine, your local laptop, compared to if you're running in a virtual machine. I think when I found that I was running my test in Sauce Labs, particularly like running an IE, that it would be a little bit slow to kind of load up the page and like start going through all kind of like the different like Selenium WebDriver actions. So I started to notice that there was like some synchronization issues, and I started to get a lot of timeouts about elements not being found for various reasons. So that's when I kind of had the need to wait for particular elements. So I guess there are a couple different types of waits that you can use. The first is implicit waits, and these are set for the kind of entire duration of a WebDriver object. And wait for X units of time. So in this example here, you can just see how you set up the driver to actually implicitly wait. For a sample number of seconds, like 10 seconds, for example. And then move on to the next step, which is finding this element by ID. The second type of wait are explicit waits. And these are kind of confined to a particular web element. And what happens here is you create this WebDriver wait object with a certain number of seconds again, and then you use that wait for an expected condition to happen. And there's various expected conditions, like you're waiting for an element to be visible or clickable or located by. And then once that happens, you can kind of move on to the next step. So obviously the big benefit of explicit waits is that you're kind of just waiting for the minimum amount of time, whereas kind of implicit waits, you're just like, wait. So I think for Selenium tests that kind of already have a reputation of being slow, you definitely don't want to be wasting any more time than you need to. So I would probably, in most situations, recommend using explicit waits when possible. So I found that kind of integrating these waits into my test helped to solve some of the synchronization issues that I was working on, and I was kind of able to move on to the next problem. And by then, my cross-browser tests were almost complete. Everything was almost kind of working like a dream. So the next problem that I'm going to highlight has to do with just driver capabilities in general. And what I have to say about this is that drivers are just not created equally. Like literally, they're managed kind of by different individuals. It's an open source project, so many people actually have the opportunity to volunteer and kind of contribute. So while Selenium is kind of based on like a certain standard, you just might find that not all capabilities that are available in one driver might be available in another. And some native capabilities just differ. So this is an example of this file upload element. So I got to the part of my test where I was uploading a file. And this is kind of just a basic file uploader here. You click on this browse link. It pops open kind of like a native file picker, and you're able to upload a file that way. And Selenium kind of has this magic where it's able to kind of determine a file uploader by this like input type equals file element here. And you're able to send keys directly to that element. And that works kind of like magic in lots of situations, but I found that it didn't quite work for every single driver that I was testing. For example, with Safari driver, I found that this was a serious problem, actually. Safari driver is implemented in JS and does not have the privileges necessary to actually manipulate this input type equals file element. So Safari driver just does not support file uploads. I don't know if you guys have experienced this before, but it was kind of like a puzzle to kind of figure out from there. And I didn't really necessarily understand like how this feature could work perfectly and all these other drivers, but just like Safari had this particular problem. So kind of it was at that point where I determined that I needed to kind of not use like Selenium WebDriver and kind of programmatically upload a file, and that's kind of how I got this working in my test. So there might be times where you run into situations where not every capability is possible, but you kind of have to find a workaround to get this functionality working in your test regardless. And another thing that I want to highlight has to do with resolution. And again, I don't think you guys can see this in the back, but this is kind of this rate check form, and the top is showing like kind of a full width resolution, whereas the bottom is kind of the same form, but in like a little bit smaller resolution. So maybe more optimized for like a mobile view, but I wanted to kind of test this sidebar over to the right here and actually see that, you know, particular interest rates were appearing. But at certain times, and it kind of depended on like where I was running my tests. So again, if I was running them in Sauce Labs and not thinking about the size of the page, then I would not be able to find any of these sidebar elements over here. So a couple tips that I have for that are first, to maximize the browser window. That should work in many cases, just to make sure that the window is kind of fully maximized. You should be able to interact with all the elements of the page. In addition, you can also set a specific resolution at runtime, almost in the same way that you would maybe maximize the screen, but instead you set size to like a particular resolution that you know is either like wide enough or long enough to kind of fit everything that you're testing within the page. And then lastly, you might actually be able to like kind of scroll to a particular element. Just make sure that it's like scrolling into view and actually is available in the DOM that you're looking at. And this might be helpful, especially as you are thinking about testing on smaller screens, and maybe in particular like mobile devices or tablets, that this definitely might come in handy. Soon after figuring out these kind of problems with page elements, various timing issues, and just driver capabilities, my cross-browser tests were complete. And this was really exciting. We were running these tests in continuous integration on a nightly basis, so they were kind of able to catch various issues as, again, we were releasing into production various times a day. So it was such a confidence booster to have these tests running. So now the next time a customer came and submitted a bug report that, hey, this like particular feature isn't working in X version of Internet Explorer or whatever, I was really able to confidently respond that we had in fact tested this and we're regularly testing it, and that these features should be working. So I think it gave our team a lot more, again, just confidence that we kind of had our bases covered and we're testing our application thoroughly. So now I just kind of want to highlight some of the lessons learned along the way. And this one is super important. This is about just starting to test early. Even though you might have a plan and it might be very clear of what you want to achieve, I think there's kind of inevitably going to be issues that you run into along the way. Various just kind of problems popped up, like the page elements, the timing issues, so things that you need to kind of plan for and have more time kind of built into for various tasks. And number 2 is about automating one feature first and then building upon that. I think this helps thinking about kind of like maybe the time that you have at hand for this particular task. I think it kind of goes in hand with the last point about kind of starting testing early, because possibly you will run into issues and then kind of have a toolkit about how you might solve these particular issues in the future. So automate one feature first and then kind of really build upon that to kind of have a really strong foundation for your test. And then run your test in CI and run them regularly, or however you're running your test, make sure to run them regularly. This way, again, you can get the most kind of valuable feedback about the state of your application that is super visible to your team. And that's it. So that's kind of my cross-browser testing journey. I hope you can think about how this might apply to different projects that you're on. Thank you guys very much. And I'm not sure how much time we have left, but I'll open it up for a few questions. Sure. Yeah, you.
You said something about a button wasn't clicked in a particular browser, and then you moved to talk about identifying an object. But I got a problem that it identified the object and still didn't click it. Did you encounter problems like that?
Yes, I did get problems where it was able to identify I guess I should kind of rephrase the question. So the question was about, did you kind of ever run into situations, you can correct me if I'm wrong, have I ever ran into situations where the element was actually found but just not clickable? So I kind of highlighted that I was commonly getting this element, error about this element not being clickable. But in all times, I didn't get an error. Sometimes it would kind of just like skip to the next step and just completely not click an element for various reasons. So I think that kind of signaled to me that this element was actually found, but for various reasons, it wasn't clickable at a certain point. And I think Chrome is a good example of that happening, because like Chrome actually might be finding this element in a particular place, but Chrome driver kind of tries to click like in the exact center of an element. So like maybe that particular like div that we were selecting or something just wasn't clickable. So I think that happens, yeah.
No, so you use wait for element to be clickable. I mean, what
Just kind of finding the right locator that actually was in fact clickable. I think that's what I do kind of more than other times. Sure, go ahead.
Can I say something about this that I have experienced already?
Sure.
The only solution I finally found, because there was no locator to interoperate with this checkbox for this example, was just to click it and push space button.
Oh,
click it and
okay.
And as I searched and searched, Stack Overflow search, the only solution was that was more safe was to just to click it with a simple celeris command, just with robot with JS JavaScript executor, I don't remember, just to push a space button, and that was interoperated with all the browsers, all of the browsers.
Okay, thank you.
Experience, would like to say.
So the suggestion up here was that kind of what worked was actually pressing the space bar in certain situations to kind of be able to click on an element. Sure, go ahead. Hi.
So you mentioned about the resolution that you can maximize the screen, but you might get false positives for the test if you actually have the sidebar missing, right? So how do you make sure that you do not have false positives?
Could you give me an example of a false positive? So like you're saying if this wasn't visible, for example, then I might get false positives in my test, like errors that like something happened, or can you give me an example?
The false positive for me is actually giving the user the option to change the size of the screen and have the sidebar disappear. Because I'm always testing the maximum size.
Right.
So it is some sort of a false positive because I'm not verifying that I have it customized to not lose the sidebar. So what do you do in this case?
Huh. That's a good question. I'm not sure exactly. I guess like what did work for me in the situation, like in the test where I was specifically verifying that these rates appeared, like they needed to be visible. So I had to make sure it was at a certain width. And again, in the cases where I was specifically testing that these rates appeared, which wasn't every single case, but I don't know. Maybe we can talk about that later. Sure, go ahead back there. Oh, good question. So there are various ways that you can run them. You can run them in parallel. Kind of the way that my CI was set up, I was kind of using a pipeline. So it would run like my Chrome test first, then run to the next browser, the next. So kind of run them sequentially. That way I can kind of view my results like in a nice way sequentially.
Like how long it takes to get the full suit executed?
It varied, and of course, like running sequentially is gonna take up more time than running these tests in parallel. I think it worked for us because we were kind of doing this on a nightly basis, running these tests sequentially. I think if timing was an issue, then we could have just had the option to run them in parallel. So I guess it kind of depends on like how exactly you want this output to be, like this information to be output, and how you might be kind of like visualizing your test results. Go ahead.
Thanks for a really good talk. I think maybe to follow on from that lady's question is, did you find you do things with Selenium You know, maybe the sidebar is not visible, but actually Selenium doesn't care it's not visible. It can go and manipulate it. So you discriminate. So it's, did you get any cases where you got false positives because Selenium could do stuff that the user couldn't?
Not that I recall. Not that I recall right now, no.
I live in fear of.
No, it's trying to use the
I've seen it with the browser where it's got visible property sets it false and it's visible.
yeah. So it depends on whether it's using native events or not. So Firefox, for example, in some operating systems, it's not using native events.
Okay.
It's using what the ones that are actually using native events, literally sending the events and the operating system. The browser that actually does exactly like the operating system.
All right, one more question. Okay, I don't know. Sure, right here in the front. Go ahead.
Do you run all the tests in all browsers, or do you, for example, choose one browser or headless browser and just run compatibility?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was, do I run all tests in all browsers, or like sometimes do I decide to like run certain tests in a browser, or like use a headless browser for others? And I think what worked really well for me in this application was kind of just like separating my features. So I kind of had like a smoke test, I guess, that like these were our like #1 most critical features. So those were run in all the browsers and like in the actual physical browser, not headless. But for kind of like more of our extensive testing and regression testing, we kind of just selected like Chrome to kind of be the one browser that we were using, and then had the option to figure out how to run the other features. And I think that was it. That's all the time that we have. But thank you all so much for attending this session. I would love to talk to you afterwards and throughout the rest of the conference about cross-browser testing. So thank you all so much.